The Second World War had witnessed the coming of age of air power. It had proved itself to be an integral part of war on land and at sea. Armies could not hope for victory unless the skies above them had been secured. Bombers and ground attack aircraft helped to pave the way for an offensive. At sea, the aircraft carrier had taken over from the battleship as the principal warship, and it was aircraft which had won the main naval battles in the Pacific. Air power, acting on its own, had pulverized cities, taking the war to the enemy's heart. Industry, communications, and morale had been severely disrupted. The level of destruction had been immense, but in spite of what the pre-war air theorists had prophesied, air power alone had not won the war for the Allies. The only possible exception to this was the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. But here it was the weapon rather than the means of delivery which had finally forced the Japanese surrender. But like the Great War of 1914-18, the Second World War proved not to be the war to end all wars, and air power has had plenty of opportunity to demonstrate its strengths and weaknesses in the numerous conflicts which have so troubled the post-1945 world. For a start, air power played a major part in the 45 years of Cold War between the capitalist and democratic West and the communist Eastern Bloc, with the manned bomber providing one arm of the nuclear triad. The aircraft of both sides constantly probed each other's airspace to test the defenses. Spy planes, like the Lockheed U-2, also took numerous high-altitude photographs of military installations. Other aircraft indulged in electronic eavesdropping over both land and sea. Yet the occasions were relatively few when aircraft were actually shot at. One of them occurred in tragic circumstances in September 1983 and involved a Russian Sukhoi Su-15. The victim was a Korean Airlines Boeing 747, which for some reason had wandered off course and was engaged by the Sukhoi. The airliner vanished from the radar screens. Some pieces of wreckage and a few corpses were all that was found of it. Outside the Cold War, the first real test for air power came in 1950, with the eruption of the Korean War. Within weeks of its outbreak, the totally surprised South Korean forces and the early United Nations arrivals had been driven back to the southeast corner of the country, around the port of Busan. The South Korean Air Force had hardly existed at the outset, while that of Communist North Korea consisted largely of Russian piston-engined aircraft. The UN forces, however, had the use of American air bases in Japan, only some 200 miles or 30 minutes flying time from Busan. Apart from piston-engined P-51 Mustangs, which had won their spurs during 1944-45, These bases also held jets in the shape of the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star and F-84 Thunderstreak. Furthermore, the US Air Force was able to reinforce quickly from the continental United States. This was thanks to air-to-air refueling. Among these reinforcements were B-29 bombers, which had so pounded Japan 5 years before. They began to do the same against targets in North Korea. They still needed a fighter escort, however, and it was as a result of this that the American jets enjoyed their first combat victories. In September 1950, the deadlock around Busan was broken with the amphibious landings at Incheon, on South Korea's northwest coast near the capital Seoul. Simultaneously, the UN forces broke out of the Busan perimeter. As they advanced northwards, air power helped to increase the North Korean confusion. And by the end of October, the UN forces had reached North Korea's border with China. It was now that Communist China entered the conflict, initially deploying in secret some 300,000 men to help beleaguered North Korea. These drove back the now overextended UN forces. By the early summer of 1951, the war had stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel, which marked the border between the two Koreas. But with the Chinese came a new air weapon, the MiG-15 jet fighter. This was superior in performance to the Shooting Stars and Thunderjets. But the Americans too fielded a new fighter, the F-86 Sabre, which was capable of supersonic speeds in a dive. The air war would now be dominated by the MiG and Sabre. American ace Ralph Parr.
The MiG had a smaller wingspan, was shorter, smaller all over, therefore harder to see. It could turn tighter, it could out-accelerate, it could out-decelerate, it could climb higher, and it had, for a while there, it had better than a 2,500 foot per minute rate of climb advantage, and it had bigger guns. It did not have a radar gun sight, but had a computing gun sight, I believe. And generally speaking, one of those advantages the MiG had will normally work for you in combat.
The Sabre was, however, superior in the dive and had a more effective gun sight. Once the war became static, the MiGs operated from bases north of the Yalu River. But so as to contain the conflict, no UN aircraft was allowed to overfly it. The MiGs tended to operate between the Yalu and the North Korean capital, Pyongyang. This area became known as MiG Alley. The MiGs usually operated in large gaggles, often outnumbering their opponents. This was especially since the Sabres used a basic four-plane formation. This was broken down into two subgroups, each consisting of a leader and a wingman. But the Sabres enjoyed a significant advantage that most of their pilots were World War II veterans, while their opponents were poorly trained, at least initially. In the spring of 1951, this changed when pilots from Eastern Europe, as well as Russian advisors, began to fly the MiGs. Francis Gabreski, an ace in both World War II and Korea.
There were pilots that I encountered that were as good as any that I have ever seen anyplace. And I have to assume from the intelligence reports and so forth that I have seen that the Russians were training the students at a certain point when they brought them into combat. And the Russian pilots, every now and then, would break away and really encounter our forces. And they were very good, very good.
Another American ace describes a combat with one of these pilots.
This guy was one fantastic pilot. I'd coast up beside him, wingtip to wingtip, and look him right in the eye. When it looked like I was going to overshoot him, I'd pull up, roll over the top, and come down on the other side of him. When I did, he'd throw the coal on it and go into a hard turn, pulling all the G's he could.
Nevertheless, the Sabre pilots did enjoy a success ratio of 10 to 1, and several of them became aces by shooting down 5 or more aircraft. The top ace was Captain Joe McConnell, who scored 16 confirmed victories. Close behind him was Manuel Fernandez. Both were highly decorated, including by South Korean President Syngman Rhee. But while the first jet versus jet tussles in the history of air warfare were the highlight of the Korean War, air power was used in many other ways. Attacks on communications were a notable feature, with the B-29s using radio-controlled bombs against bridges. A-26 invaders concentrated on road and rail networks to disrupt the communist supply system. This, however, was not wholly successful, since the damage was quickly repaired. The communists also took to carrying out most of their movement by night. For close air support of the ground troops, it was found that the piston-engined Mustang was more effective than jets, which often flew too fast to be able to identify targets accurately. Among the weapons used was napalm, which was especially effective in helping to break up the human wave attacks favored by the Chinese. Carrier-based aircraft also played their part in attacking ground targets. The Korean War, however, produced no new lessons in the use of air power, except to reinforce its importance in conventional warfare. But elsewhere on the Pacific Rim, two other campaigns of a very different nature were being waged. One in the jungles of Malaya. Here the British were using aircraft, including the Spitfire of World War II fame, to bomb and strafe suspected communist terrorist camps. However, air power contributed little to eventual victory over the terrorists, which was achieved mainly by good intelligence and jungle skills. Likewise, the French were trying to cling onto their territories in Indochina. Laos and Cambodia were virtually independent, but the indigenous communist Viet Minh were trying to gain control of Vietnam, and a bitter war was being waged. The French tried everything to defeat the Viet Minh, including massive sweeps of the countryside. Aircraft, initially obsolete types, but soon reinforced by more modern American planes, were widely used. Matters came to a head in autumn 1953, when the French set up a fire base around the village of Dien Bien Phu and astride the main Viet Minh supply route, but quickly found themselves under siege. Constant attacks from the air could not break the Viet Minh stranglehold. French reinforcements were dropped in by parachute. Supplies too were delivered in the same way, although many fell into Viet Minh hands. But French dominance of the skies could not prevent the garrison situation from becoming increasingly desperate, and it was eventually forced to surrender after a 6-month siege. Dien Bien Phu was the final nail in the French coffin. In summer 1954, they left Vietnam, and the focus of conflict switched to the Middle East. In July 1956, the Egyptians nationalized that crucial waterway, the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. Britain and France, the two principal shareholders, resolved to regain it by force through landings at Port Suez. British Vickers Valiant bombers were used to pound Egyptian airfields and other military installations. After 4 days, French and British paratroops dropped to seize key points. Next day, amphibious landings were made from the sea. Casualties were light, but the operation was helped by the fact that the Egyptians were also trying to deal with an attack from another direction. Israeli forces had invaded Egyptian-held Sinai and were racing to the Suez Canal from the east. The Israeli Air Force supported the ground offensive. But Israeli Air Commander Dan Tolkovsky had wanted to use his aircraft in a preemptive strike on the Egyptian airfields. He was forbidden to do this, since the British bombers had taken on this task. Nevertheless, the IAF remained wedded to Tolkovsky's doctrine. Israel's Arab neighbors wanted revenge for the 1956 debacle, and this kept the Air Force on a constant high state of alert. By the mid-1960s, the IAF was equipped largely with French aircraft. These were mainly fighter bombers. there was the Sud-Ouest Vautour light bomber, and the Dassault Mirage 3, as well as Mystère. President Nasser of Egypt and his Arab allies had largely forsaken the West for Moscow and possessed mainly Soviet aircraft. These included the Ilyushin Il-28 bomber, and the MiG-21 fighter. The Israelis, fearing an attack, decided to preempt it with one of their own, with Egyptian airfields as their first target. Yet attacking the Sinai airfields would alert mainland Egyptian bases. The Israelis therefore decided on a simultaneous strike coming in from the Mediterranean and hitting these airfields from the west. The Israeli aircraft struck at 7:45 a.m. on the 5th of June 1967. They flew at low level, both to avoid radar detection and ensure greater accuracy. So confused were the Egyptians that they initially accused aircraft of the American Sixth Fleet, which was based in the Mediterranean, of carrying out the attacks west of the Suez Canal. The Israeli aircraft returned to base to be rearmed and refueled. Their air plan called for an immediate second strike against the Egyptian airfields. The result of the two attacks was that 2/3 of the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground. In the meantime, Israeli armored columns were racing into Sinai, throwing the Egyptians into ever greater confusion. That afternoon, the IAF turned on Jordan and Syria, and by the end of the day, the small Jordanian Air Force had ceased to exist. Thereafter, the IAF switched to support of the ground forces. Air-to-air combats did, however, take place. Although the aircraft of both sides were armed with air-to-air missiles, it was significant that the Israeli fighters, which enjoyed overwhelming success, claiming over 50 victories, achieved these with cannon alone. But pilot superiority was the decisive factor. Such was the Israeli victory in what became known as the Six-Day War that she was left with vast amounts of captured territory in Sinai, on the Syrian Golan Heights, and on the west bank of the River Jordan. But the victory would not have been nearly so spectacular if it had not been for the part played by the Air Force in ensuring that the skies above the fast-moving ground forces were kept free of hostile aircraft. It had indeed been an awesome demonstration of the effectiveness of air power. But thousands of miles away, the Americans were also deploying air power on an increasingly massive scale. For 1967 saw the US involvement in Vietnam beginning to reach its zenith. The result of the French withdrawal from Indochina was a divided Vietnam, the communist North and Western-backed South. But within a short time, communist guerrillas in South Vietnam had begun a terrorist campaign to reunify the country. American military advisors were already in country, helping to form and train the fledgling South Vietnamese forces. However, in the early 1960s, Viet Cong activity, backed by North Vietnam, increased sharply. By 1964, much of rural Vietnam was under Viet Cong control, and some members of the US government thought that bombing North Vietnam was the only solution. Then, in August 1964, an American destroyer, the Maddox, was fired on by North Vietnamese patrol boats while on an intelligence-gathering mission. This gave President Lyndon Johnson his excuse.
To any armed attack upon our forces, we shall reply. To any in Southeast Asia who ask our help in defending their freedom, we shall give it.
US carrier aircraft mounted attacks against North Vietnamese naval installations. These, however, were no more than a demonstration that the United States was prepared to strike back. But the situation in South Vietnam had continued to worsen, and F-100 Super Sabres already based there were reinforced, with further aircraft deployed to Thailand. In March 1965, the Americans launched Rolling Thunder, an air offensive against selected targets in North Vietnam and designed to halt Hanoi's support for the Viet Cong. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin now visited Hanoi, and China too condemned the US action. Both promised material and economic aid. The North Vietnamese air defenses included Soviet-supplied MiG-17s, but so restricted were the American pilots that they were initially not allowed to attack the airfields from which these operated. The North Vietnamese also had an increasing amount of anti-aircraft artillery, or AAA. Provided the American aircraft stayed high enough, this was not initially a major threat. The air crews also believed that their air-to-air missiles would keep the MiGs at bay. But the American aircraft did not have cannon, and the MiGs were sometimes able to get within minimum missile range and shoot the US planes down with their guns. US aircraft, therefore, had to be hastily fitted with cannon pods. In the summer of 1965, a new threat appeared in the form of Soviet surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs. This gave the American pilots a serious problem, as one explains.
If you duck just under the clouds, you have a better visual shot at the SAMs and better visual navigation. But you give both the SAM people and the ground gunners a perfect silhouette of your aircraft against the cloud backdrop, at the same time telegraphing your exact altitude for both sighting and fusing purposes. If you go far below the clouds, up goes the fuel consumption and up goes the exposure to smaller guns on the ground.
As a result, AAA became the main threat, accounting for no less than 300 F-4 Phantoms alone. Those American air crews shot down over North Vietnam faced a grim time. They were subjected to months and sometimes years of solitary confinement, as well as brainwashing and physical torture. Some spent up to 8 years in captivity before being finally released. Rolling thunder persisted until almost the end of 1968. It concentrated on North Vietnam's limited industry, oil installations, and communications. To ensure accuracy, a new generation of smart weapons made its appearance. The earliest of these was the bullpup, which had to be guided onto its target. This meant that the aircraft had to remain in the target area and was vulnerable to both ground and air attack. But a major part of the American air effort in Vietnam was in support of the ground forces. Here, a crucial player was the Airborne Forward Air Controller in his OV-10 Bronco, who directed aircraft onto their targets. Bronco crews needed cool heads to circle under enemy fire and coordinate the airstrikes. Indeed, 2 FACs in Vietnam were awarded America's highest decoration, the Congressional Medal of Honor. Very active in the ground attack role was the piston-engine Douglas A-1 Skyraider, whose slower speed meant that it could locate targets more easily than the fast jets. But there was a penalty, as a Phantom pilot who also flew A-1s pointed out.
I was not at all comfortable with how long it took a particular tree to go by, wondering whether some Viet Cong didn't step out and shoot me in the forehead with a pistol. That extra 300 knots makes the world of difference.
But not only A-1s and fast jets were used for ground attack. B-52 strategic bombers were also employed, regularly smothering the jungle with 500-pound bombs, each plane carrying over 100 of these. So concentrated was the B-52 bombing that it literally altered the map of some parts of South Vietnam. The Americans also used a more controversial air weapon, Agent Orange. This was a defoliant and was designed to remove the jungle cover which was such an ally to the Viet Cong. In 1969, the emphasis of the Strategic Air Campaign switched to the Viet Cong supply lines. The main supply route was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, after North Vietnam's leader. It consisted of little more than jungle tracks and ran from North Vietnam down through Laos and Cambodia and into the very heart of South Vietnam. One of the weapons used against the Ho Chi Minh Trail was the gunship, of which the most notable was the AC-130 Spectre. Armed with multi-barrel miniguns and even a 105mm gun, the Spectre could lay down a devastating carpet of fire. Yet in spite of the massive air effort, as well as ground incursions into Laos and Cambodia, supplies continued to flow down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In 1970, the Americans began to wind down their ground strength in Vietnam, largely because of the growing unpopularity of the war. But US air power remained to bolster the indigenous forces. In spring 1972, the North Vietnamese launched a ground offensive into South Vietnam. In retaliation, President Nixon ordered a resumption of the bombing of North Vietnam under the codename Linebacker. Now the Americans had a second generation of smart weapons available: the electro-optical Walleye and laser-guided Paveway. These were fire-and-forget weapons. But the North Vietnamese AAA and SAM defenses were now very elaborate and largely radar-controlled. Aircraft equipped with sophisticated electronics and radar homing missiles were used to suppress these. The F-111, whose primary role was as a nuclear bomber, also took part in Linebacker, its terrain-following radar and sophisticated navigation systems enabling it to operate on its own over North Vietnam. Linebacker was halted in October 1972, when negotiations in Paris between Washington and Hanoi seemed close to achieving agreement. The talks then stalled, and Linebacker was resumed. But after 12 days, the North Vietnamese expressed a willingness to return to the negotiating table, and so President Nixon ordered a halt to all offensive operations. Vietnam was a proving ground for new aviation technologies. But in the end, the massive weight of American air power served merely to prolong the war rather than prevent the inevitable outcome. For Vietnam was essentially a war of hearts and minds, over which sophisticated weaponry could exert little influence. However, air power was continuing to demonstrate its effectiveness in more conventional conflicts. In October 1973, the Egyptians made a sudden attack across the Suez Canal, quickly overrunning the Israeli defenses on the east bank. That the attack was a surprise prevented the Israeli Air Force from gaining air superiority through a preemptive strike. Instead, it was tied to support of the ground forces from the outset. But the Israelis now faced a comprehensive belt of SAM missiles, although the Americans, whose planes now largely equipped the IAF, were passing over the fruits of their Vietnam experience. Nevertheless, the Arab air defenses did account for a comparatively large number of Israeli aircraft. Air-to-air combats did take place, although, as in 1967, the Israeli pilots proved to be better trained than their adversaries. Indeed, only 5 Israeli aircraft were shot down in these encounters, as opposed to many times this number of MiGs. In the meantime, the Americans were having to relearn fighter pilot skills as a result of Vietnam. As one ace put it,
everything that a fighter pilot has worked for, trained for, learned, studied over a period of 5, 10, 15 years has to come together and work in an instant of time.
The U.S. Navy set up its fighter weapons school at Miramar, San Diego. Its aim?
How to stay alive in combat, mostly. We teach them everything from the basics of 1 versus 1 to multi-plane tactics, but how to stay alive and how to kill.
More popularly known as Top Gun, selected pilots were sent here to perfect their skills, often flying against aircraft flown by their instructors. Such was its immediate success that one of the early graduates, Lieutenant Randy Cunningham, became one of only 4 genuine aces of the Vietnam War. The U.S. Air Force also established Red Flag at Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada. Here, complete squadrons rotated through a demanding exercise which covered all roles, from air-to-air against resident aggressor squadrons to close air support against targets on the school's extensive ranges. The fruits of Top Gun and Red Flag were to be harvested 20 years later, during the 1991 Gulf War. This was to see the whole panoply of modern air power in action. Within a few days of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, British and American fighter squadrons were deployed to Saudi Arabia. Here they prepared to resist a further Iraqi attack, this time into Saudi Arabia itself. A massive air bridge was set up between the United States and Saudi Arabia. The transport aircraft delivered both men and material. Besides the Americans and the British, French and Italian aircraft were also deployed. There were also contributions from the Arab members of the coalition, including this Saudi F-15 Eagle. Boeing E-3 Sentry airborne early warning AWACS and RC-135 rivet joint electronic intelligence aircraft constantly patrolled the skies. SR-71 Blackbird and U-2R spy planes also contributed to the intelligence picture, together with satellites. When Desert Shield became Desert Storm in the early hours of the 17th of January 1991, the first blows were struck by Tomahawk cruise missiles fired by ships. The latest in American aviation technology, the Lockheed F-117A stealth fighter, also took part in these opening strikes. Its targets, Iraqi Air Defense Command, Control and Communications Centers. The Iraqi air defenses were thrown into instant disarray. Grumman Prowler Electronics countermeasures aircraft added to this confusion with their strikes against Iraqi radars. the British Tornadoes were given a special task: attacks against Iraqi airfields, using the JP-233 runway denial weapon. This entailed going in at low level, as a Tornado crewman describes.
Our first aircraft attacked the field, and all of a sudden there was a wall of AAA. It seemed that everyone on this airfield was firing at us. It was going above us, below us, down both wings. The whole place was lit up. We were close to the other aircraft and we could see their weapons going off. We had to grit our teeth and keep going.
The crews then made for home, where they found that many of their aircraft had received AAA strikes. Some, though, were shot down, and, like other Allied pilots, used for Iraqi propaganda.
What was your mission?
To attack an Iraqi airfield. I think our leaders and our people have wrongly attacked the peaceful people of Iraq.
The Iraqi Air Force itself was sizable and made up largely of Russian types, including the MiG-29. But after the first week, many Iraqi aircraft fled to neighboring Iran. Other coalition air targets included chemical weapons facilities and transportation. As the campaign unfolded, the world was able to see for itself and marvel at the accuracy of modern precision-guided weapons.
Delta Oscar. So are you using day 16?
About 1553.
Okay, going to that.
Yet only 10% of the munitions used were smart, the vast majority still being dumb iron bombs. With air supremacy firmly established, the coalition air forces now turned on the Iraqi forces in Kuwait itself. The object was to reduce their fighting capability to such an extent that the ground forces would be able to evict them with the very minimum of casualties. These attacks were aimed at isolating the Iraqis by cutting off their communications with their own country. The Iraqis in Kuwait were also subjected to direct attack. One of the weapons used for this was the now veteran B-52 bomber, whose weight of munitions exceeded that of any other aircraft in the coalition armory. Unforeseen, however, was the need to divert resources to tackle the problem of the Iraqi mobile Scud launchers. This was crucial, since Scud attacks on Israel very nearly brought that country into the war. If that had happened, it's likely that the Arab members of the coalition might well have withdrawn from it. This threat was averted by the deployment of Patriot SAM batteries to Israel to intercept the Scuds before they struck. After 5 weeks, priority switched to support of the ground offensive, and it was now that the A-10 Warthog ground attack aircraft came into its own. This and other types played their part in the blitzkrieg which finally liberated Kuwait. Air power enabled the ground forces to achieve the ultimate goal in a mere 4 days. But although they came close to doing so, aircraft could still not win wars on their own.